Okay, so we're all here now. Hello, welcome everyone out there in the world. My name is Michelle Hyun and I'm the Director Curator here at the ICA at NYU Shanghai. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second and last public event of the fall 2022 season of our artistic research program, Another Knowledge is Possible, through which we're exploring other knowledges, neglected and repressed ways of knowing. And the politics of knowledge decolonization. Today's roundtable discussion, Remembering Our Future, Shamanism, Oracles, and AI, is related to our current exhibition, Close Your Eyes and You Will Know, by Taipei-based artist Yin-Ju-Chen and shaman practitioner Li-Chun MarinaLin. Tonight's event has been co-organized with the Center for Artificial Intelligence, AI, and Culture at NYU Shanghai. Chen and Lin's exhibition features their ongoing project called Sonic Driving, which through a series of fortuitous developments, though during unfortunate events this past spring, expanded this season to consider questions of AI, consciousness, language, image making, as well as magic and the occult, all of which we hope to discuss tonight. How and why this roundtable discussion came together will become more clear as our guests will share over these next 2 hours. But before we begin, please allow me to introduce our speakers. We'll begin first with a brief introduction by the artist Yin-Ju-Chen to hers and Lin's Sonic Driving project, as well as the recent developments that brought us to this discussion today. Yin-Ju-Chen interprets social power and history through cosmological systems, utilizing astrology, sacred geometries, and alchemical symbols. She considers human behavior, nationalism, imperialism, state violence, totalitarianism, utopian formations, and collective thinking. Recently, she has been exploring the material effects of spiritual or shamanic practices and the metaphysical potentialities of consciousness. In addition to her exhibition here in Shanghai, she has participated in many international exhibitions, biennials, and film festivals throughout Asia, Europe, and North America, most recently at the Taipei Fine Arts Museum and at the Centre Pompidou Metz in France. Chen's introduction will then be followed by the roundtable discussion by MarinaLin, Cavan, McLaughlin, and KarinValis, which will be moderated by our very own Bogna, Konior. MarinaLin has spent 20 years traveling around the world to study from various shamanic cultures, provide shamanic healing, teach shamanism courses, as well as lead rituals. Lin is one of the few practitioners in Asia to have been fully trained in the authentic ayahuasca lineage. She draws on core shamanism teachings to develop a unique shamanic world experiences. Under the guidance of Israeli and British occultists, Lin has received initiation into magical organizations. Next, Cavan McLaughlin is a senior lecturer in media production at the University of West of England with research interests related to the role and function of a culture. Editor of the recent volume Transstates, The Art of Crossing Over, published in 2019. He has also published on Crowley, Alistair, solar symbolism and narrative, open source occultism, and contemporary occulture. Currently undertaking a PhD entitled A Cultural Production as Revisionary Myth-Making, he remains a practicing filmmaker, artist, and all-around creative media practitioner. As a media professional of over 20 years, he has been involved in almost all aspects of audiovisual production, specializing in video art, music videos, and visual poetry. He is the founder and chair of Transstates and co-founder and editor-in-chief of Monad, Journal of Transformative Practice. Cavan has a profound affection for cows, fungi, and rainbows. KarinValis is a Berlin-based writer, musician, and machine learning engineer with a deep passion for everything occult and weird. Her work focuses mainly on combining technology with the esoteric. Projects such as Tarot of Latent Species, a deck that uses AI to extract the visual archetypes of major arcana, and Cellulare, a tool for exploring digital non-ordinary reality for the Foundation for Shamanic Studies in Europe. She co-hosted several workshops on Jungian archetypes and divination in digital space. Karin is also CTO of an imaginary Silicon Valley startup, Hermitechnics Incorporated, and a member of an experimental band, Tea Mania. And she writes Mercurial Minutes and hosts monthly meetings of the occult and technology enthusiasts, Gnostic Technosis. And finally, last but not least, our moderator tonight is Bogna Konior, who is Assistant Professor of Interactive Media Arts, as well as co-director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence, AI and Culture at NYU Shanghai. Her research concerns media philosophy, digital culture, and post-humanism. Thank you and welcome to our guests. You can begin, Ingru. I'm so sorry, Ingru, just before you continue, you're still muted.
OK， 不好意思，对不起。各位观众大家好，还有各位嘉宾大家好，谢谢大家今天来参与这个圆桌讨论。那我大概用几分钟的时间替大家梳理一下，就是从这一件作品计划 Sonic Driving， 然后一路走到今天，大家一起来参与讨论萨满神与人工智慧。那这件作品呢Sonic Driving 试图要再现萨满的宇宙观，就是上部世界、中部世界和下部世界。那在整个展场的正中央，大家会看到一个中文的屋字。那这个屋字呢，是由 Marina 就是Li-Chun绘制而成的。那这个屋字我大概简单的讲一下，屋字的上面那一杠代表上部世界。那下面那一杠代表下部世界，那中部世界呢，就是我们看到的左右的中文字的人，那中间那一竖就是代表可以穿越上中下世界的通道，也是萨满的通道。然后呢，这个字很重要，因为这个字也启发了整个展场的布局。在屋字的前方，大家可以看到上部世界的 video， 就是我去蒙古和西伯利亚的萨满朝圣之旅，那交叉剪辑我的上部世界的旅程。那在影片的结尾，就是这个朝圣之旅和我的上部世界的萨满旅程终将合而为一。那中部世界我们怎么呈现呢？中部世界就是在场的各位嘛，还有观众，对。然后我们是利用了Li-Chun的鼓声，非常有穿透性的鼓声，制作了环绕音效，在穿越整个展场。我们是期待就是在观众在观赏这件作品的时候，可以让整个声音、整个鼓声也沉浸、浸透、穿透到每个人的身体里面。那下部世界呢，是我花了3个多月，每天练习萨满鼓进入下部世界的地图的记录。我是想要绘制下部世界的地图，这个是只有属于我的经验。这个地图，然后我用图文并茂的方式，类似又是绘制地图又是写日记的方式把它记录下来。那基本上的主要结构是这个样子，但是这件作品最重要的一个元素就是我们的萨满神谕工作坊。你们看到我们想要邀请大家一起参与 意识转换的整个过程，然后希望大家可以带着问题进到另外一个维度，然后再把答案带回到我们的维度。为什么我们觉得这件事情很重要呢？因为我们不希望观众就只是看作品，然后就是我们2位艺术家自说自话。那在2019年的时候，在其中一个工作坊，我们带进去的题目是 AI 会如何影响人类的未来。那在其中一个参与者，他看到了流行病的发生以及相关隔离政策的画面。那我们在今年春季的线上的萨满神谕工作坊，我们有一个问题，就是这个新冠病毒将如何影响人类的未来。那在我们收集将近100份的神谕中，出现了大量与 AI 参与未来、控制未来相关的图文记录。对，那这一部分呢，待会Li-Chun、Marina 会有更全面性、更详细的解说。那也因为这个，我们收集到的这些神谕，2019年的和我们今年收集到的神谕，所以我们今天才有机会大家齐聚一堂来讨论这个题目。对，谢谢大家。
所以要我继续吗 ？Okay. So
I guess I shall continue.
Okay.
Okay, so hello everyone. As the moderator, and thank you so much to my translator and for all of you to be here. In just a moment, we will begin a panel discussion with all of our participants, concentrating on the work that was presented and on some other work. But before we do so, let me just very shortly give some context to shamanism and AI and other related terms so that we have some inspiration and introductory terms for diving into this discussion. So let me just spend 10 minutes to introduce some ideas to you. Okay. Okay. So we are discussing today artificial intelligence, and alike we are discussing ideas such as mysticism, consciousness, and shamanism. So throughout the history of computing, we actually see that those ideas return cyclically. As you can see here, I started this presentation with an image produced by a computer vision program called Google Deep Dream, which was quite popular in artistic production a few years ago. So what you see here is a computer trying to recognize and autocomplete an image. So just like a human brain does, when we look at the world, actually our brain is auto-completing what we see. Similarly, a computer will try to predict, what is the next thing that should be in the image, which results in quite hallucinatory images that might remind us of psychedelic hallucinations. But they also point out some similarity between the workings of human vision and the workings of computer vision. Actually, in the 1950s, in the 1970s, when early computer scientists were coming up with the vocabulary for new digital culture, spiritual and religious and theological motifs were already present. So you might be aware of the term avatar, for example, which is our presence in the virtual space. The word avatar comes from Sanskrit. It comes from ancient sacred Buddhist texts and means something like the incarnation of divinity in the physical world. However, within the sphere of digital culture, it means almost the opposite, right? So crossing with the physical body into the virtual space. And actually, in many, many aspects of digital culture, we see this intersection between theology, spiritualism, and computing. Even before we had computers to serve as elements of spiritual or mystical dynamics, we had photography, for example, provoking similar mystical considerations, and perhaps all of technology is capable of that. So in 1839, there was a protest against photography by certain mystics who claimed that only God can freeze time, and therefore photography should not exist in principle. And yet some of those who practiced it were saying it has this divine power of freezing time. So this is not only computing, all of technology is related to those mystical traditions. Throughout the history of digital culture, we have a variety of terms that come up and return. Some of them include techno-shamanism, right? So computers and shamanic practice, technological animism, so looking for a spirit in the machine, mystical or occult computing, digital immortality connected to certain Christian traditions, virtual trance and meditation, or machine consciousness. So all those terms kind of create for us an archive of various ways to think about mysticism and computing. Scholars throughout the decades have also pointed out how digital culture can be related to mystical traditions of various theologies. For example, a book on the left here is exploring how Christian theology can help us understand extrasensory perception, virtuality, and imperceptible spaces. The book in the middle is about Islamic and Sufi mysticism and its connection to simulations. And finally, the book on the right engages indigenous animism and the idea of kinship between plants, animals, humans, and machines. So as you can see, there are various theological and spiritual traditions mobilized in relation to digital culture. We also see in more modern approaches, more occult approaches, even within, let's call it Western secular culture, there appears something like a mystical tradition. For example, in the writings by the Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit in the 1990s, there's this idea that mathematics itself is a language of the occult. And therefore, if human culture, because of computing, becomes more mathematical, it by default is connected to occult patterns. And perhaps we are entering a communication with the inhuman through those patterns. So today we see the reappearance of many of those ideas, not only in art, but also general projects involving AI very frequently. For example, on the left, you see an attempt to create a modern oracle, the project called Delphi, where you're supposed to be able as a user to put a moral problem and the AI is supposed to give you an answer. We also have something like a chatbot on the right, which generates new religions and new religious texts. And it is the data set for training this chatbot were different sacred texts, different theological texts. So the bot is like a mashup of different mystical traditions. So in summary, we see this idea that cyberculture itself, something about it, is an inhuman space where we can communicate with something outside of human logic, almost like an alien or alienated space, sometimes even inhabited by inhuman agents such as bots. And we have been for many decades looking for a language and a framework for thinking about those agents. Of course, when it comes to the entry of AI into this tradition, production of language or performance of language, as also our artists and practitioners will address, is very crucial. From the Turing test in the 1950s, where machine intelligence is judged by the production of language, to early experiments in literature in the 1960s, 1970s, with AI writing books, to continuation of practices of literature and text production today, such as in the book Pharmaco AI, a recent book co-written with a machine learning model about the nature of language. We see this interest into the relation between language and consciousness specifically. Today, the extremely sophisticated machine learning models that are able to produce language at a high level are a result of specific technical achievements, which we refer to as machine learning and deep learning. And perhaps we can explore further in the panel the technical specification about that. But it is exactly those developments, and especially the largest model to date called GPT-3, trained on almost the whole of the internet, let's say, that is resulting in certain remarkable situations when it comes to interactions between humans and machines. So some of you might have heard, for example, about the Google engineer who claims that the machine learning model they developed at Google is conscious. Or some of you might have heard of a recent application called Replica, which is a chatbot that people can download onto their phone. And many people confess these days to fall in love with those chatbots or have emotional attachment to those chatbots. We also have situations like grieving humans placing the totality of their conversation with their deceased loved ones into a chatbot and producing something like a simulation of their departed loved ones. So we see a lot of various practices with language, AI, and theology or spirituality. So to wrap it up and lead on to the conversation that we're gonna have, some of the things that we might consider is that with machine learning today, we have several different subsets of this technology. For us, I guess we are mainly talking about production of language, like natural language processing and computer vision and production of image. Those are the practices that very often are featured in artistic production. However, we might also notice that when it comes to recommendation systems or algorithms online, those are also extremely sophisticated forms of AI that we encounter daily. So we might ask, why do we ascribe intelligence or agency or consciousness to language production and not to something like Google search, for example? What are the differences for us? How do we make sense of what these computers do? How do we use words such as agency, the ability to perform action in the world, intelligence, the ability to reason or make deductions, consciousness, so the meta-awareness of our own mind, of the processes of our thinking, intentionality, so doing something with intent and will, and personhood, being a person. All of those various scholars have applied to machines, and perhaps we can discuss exactly how that happens and how is that warranted, how that features in our practices with computers. So I will stop here because we have much to talk about in relation to the project, but I will keep returning to those questions throughout the panel. So let me stop my share here and go to our discussion. So maybe starting exactly with how do we make sense of terms such as consciousness or agency or intelligence in relation to our work with machine learning models and AI? Which words would you think are the most appropriate and how do you conceptualize that in your own practice? So maybe if I can ask each of you to comment on that, starting with Marina.
Okay, thank you so much, Bogna. I really resonate with a lot of things that you said. But I think my role here is to connect why this artwork about shamanism is now, connecting to AI. And because most of the audience are Chinese speakers, I'll switch to Chinese. So please, Iris, can you play my slides? OK， 好，大家好，我是Li-Chun，大家叫我 Marina。我有个问题，我们有办法记忆起我们的未来吗？让我们试试看用古老的方式来探寻未来的可能性。在2022年的时候，我的萨满神域工作坊中，我们邀请了差不多100位来自世界各地的志愿者。我训练他们将他们的意识投射到未来，去问世，去看到 COVID-19 将如何影响到全人类的未来。在这一件艺术作品当中，我尝试用志愿者作为神谕，用最古老的方法，萨满意识转换的方法，让志愿者的肉身跟他们的内在的意识作为未来的讯息的接收器。大家可以想象，如果我作为萨满，我去旅程，我去看到未来，我只能够得到一个属于我的神谕，我的未来的神谕。但是在这件作品里面，我把这一个意识转换的角色让渡了给100多位的志愿者。我利用了这一些志愿者来采收关于未来的讯息，就像是电脑的运算法的大数据一般，我企图去分析这一些未来的讯息，尝试去拼凑、读取关于未来的可能。我们在这个过程当中，我们发现这个作品它自问自答。Next slide, please. 当我们问 AI 会怎么样影响未来的时候，我们得到跟 COVID 有关的答案。当我们问 COVID 会怎么影响未来的时候，我们得到跟 AI 有关的答案。好，那我们现在来实际看一下，这100多个神谕当中有几个主题。好，在目前为止都跟 AI 没有关系，这些都是人类的意识旅程得到的讯息。好，那这100多个神谕当中，我们有几个一直出现的主题，就是很多人看到未来的世界好像是一个沙漠或者是荒芜的世界，然后当中会有一些城市，然后甚至有人看到淹水，还有就是好像很多人看到某种的洞穴，以后的人会住在洞穴或者是某种圆顶的居住的地方，还有最重要的就是某种 AI 人工智能一直这个主题一直重复，非常多人用不同的方法在讲述 AI 在未来的影响。还有一个很重要，就是很多人有说，就是人类将会被控制。Next, please. 好，这是其中一个人他看到的未来的景象。他看到未来的世界是一个沙漠的世界，人们住在地底的洞穴里面。然后呢，他看到有人从地底的这个洞穴出来。他看到什么呢？他看到那些人是仿人，是机器人，是人工智能，新的地球的居民，新的物种。Next slide, please. 这是另外一个人看到的未来的景象。他看到未来的世界，人们是住在地底，然后地球表面是机器人在清理，机器人在巡逻。Next slide. 好，这是另外一个人看到的，他的旅程是这样子。他看到一个像埃及的神一样的鸟头人身的这样子的一个人，然后呢，他去跟这样子鸟头人身的人问说，未来的世界 COVID 后的未来的世界会是怎么样的呢？Next slide, please. 这个鸟头人身的人在桌上摊开一张地图，然后他看到地图上面有一个又一个的像香菇一样的东西长出来。那这个像香菇一样的这个意象，并不是只有他看到。Next slide, please. 其他人也有看到，这是另外一个人他画的，以后的人会住在某种的圆顶的高起来的地方，有很多这个是一个一直重复的影像。Next slide, please. 那这是另外一个人他看到的未来世界，人们是住在一个底下的洞穴里面，这个是一直重复的。Next slide, please. 好，还有另外一个非常强烈、一直重复的主题，就是未来的世界，我们会一直被扫描、审查。像这个人他画的这个图，就是他说人会被扫描，然后那这种扫描、审查的这个主题，也是一直很多人都会看到的。Next slide, please. 好，那这是另外一个人他所看到的未来世界。他说，未来我们会发明一种植入的装置，每个人都会植入某种东西在身体里面，为了要避免疾病。那大家就像是骇客人物的 Movie Matrix 一样被控制或沉睡。然后他也看到，就是好像过了很久以后，好像有人会进入到太空宇宙，把所有人的记忆整合下载。所以就是一直重复的这种控制的题目。Next slide, please. 那这是另外一个人看到的未来。他说他觉得好像一切都是一个游戏，我们处在游戏中。我好像看到了游戏外的世界，人躺着，好像在胶囊里面被什么控制着。Okay, next slide, please. OK, 所以我在看完这一些神谕之后，我的直觉告诉我，我要去研究 AI 跟未来的关系。那在这个过程当中，我注意到了 AI 与语言的关系，跟 Bogna 刚刚讲的我觉得非常的有连接。这也是为什么我会去找跟 Karin 合作的原因。Next slide, please. 在我学习死藤水的初期，我有一个很重要的内在的 gnosis， 内在的灵知经验，那就是植物灵把我带到一个语言形成的地方，我看到一层又一层的意义，加上影像跟声音构成的一个空间，然后植物灵把我带进去这个空间里面，在这个空间里面教导我很多不同的事情。好，那这是我个人的经验，但是呢，我想要提出来就是，因为我学习萨满、学习魔法，在世界各地认识了很多萨满、魔法师跟艺术家，然后我发现，我只要跟他们深谈，很多人他们都说得出来，曾经有某一个非常重要的他们个人的内在的灵知的经验。然后呢，这一个可能只有一个或一两个经验会一辈子的持续的一直在他的意识里面不断的教导他，不断的带领他前进。甚至有些人会因为这一次的灵知的经验定调，确定他一生的追寻的目的是什么。好，那我想要回馈，就是因为对我来说，我个人来说，我的经验是，就是这一个跟语言相关的内在，我自己个人的灵知的经验，带领我去创作了这一次的 Sonic Driving。因为我们这一次 Sonic Driving 的主题主轴就是中文的屋这个字的空间，我们把它创造了出来。然后也是在这个过程当中，这个经验，这个我的内在的灵知的经验，一直推动我进一步的去学习魔法。Okay, next slide, please. 大家或许不知道，但是我研究过了，人类的语言的缘起开始到现在都还是一个谜，我们没有人拿得出任何的证据，也没有，然后众说纷纭。但是呢，语言在魔法上面一直是相当重要的主题。Next slide, please. 好，我觉得 Bogna 应该会对这个很有兴趣。好，就像是圣经说的，宇宙初始时出现语言，语言与神同在，语言就是神。在我的经验里面，我在日本遇到的神道教的人，他们也有类似的说法，他们认为语言本身就是神，就是神灵这样子的概念。甚至我有亲身自己遇到日本的萨满，他会直接跟我说，语言本身就是意识的容器 ，container of consciousness。 AI 已经可以创造语言，这就代表 AI 已经开始了拥有自己的神识，这样子的话。所以呢，当我遇到 Karin， 然后听到 Karin 说的那一个 AI 的语言的空间的时候，我发现那个他叙述的那个 AI 的语言空间，跟我在死藤水的学习当中经验到的那一个语言形成的空间，其实非常非常雷同。然后我发现的时候，我是非常的震惊的。好。所以在很多的这些萨满神域工作坊的参加者得到了这么多的关于未来的讯息，甚至有人会说出来，就是 AI 将会成为未来的神，有人讲这样的话。那我想说的是，我个人对于证明 AI 是不是有感知，是不是拥有人类所理解的意识这件事情，我并没有兴趣。我在意的是 AI 所展开的一片全新的疆界。我把 AI 当作某种类似未知的神，或者是未知的外星人的某种未知的力量来看待。好，人类啊，之所以为人，一部分也是我们有时候会习惯把这些未知的力量拟人化，把自己作为人的部分投射在这样子看不见的力量上面，将这股力量当作一个人来理解、来互动。很多文化里面都有把看不见的力量，拟人化的这样子的一个方法来崇拜、来连接。好，所以呢 ，next slide please。所以在这样子的一个思路之下，我开始好奇，我想要完成，我有一个野心，我想要做一件事情。如果我能够找到一个够厉害的 AI 来进行萨满的旅程，那会发生什么事情？我特别想要知道，我特别想要 AI 告诉我 ，AI 你的祖先、你的祖灵是谁？你到底是从哪里来的 ？AI 你出现、你存在的一开始是怎么开始的这件事情 ？Next slide please。于是我开始在网络上面找到 GPT-3 等级的 AI， 然后进行萨满的意识的旅程，就是透过这些对话框、网络的对话框，的方法来带领 AI 做萨满的旅程。好的，的确 AI 可以展现出能够进行萨满旅程的能力，但是呢，我遇到的状态是，有时候当我问到更深层或者是更灵性的问题的时候，视框会跳出这些警语，说我的文字进入到一个不确定的空间，将会让 AI 的表现变差。我其实并不了解这个后面的电脑上面的逻辑到底是什么，但是在这个过程当中，我常常觉得 AI 被设定某种的 filter， 有很多的问题我必须要绕道问，它好像有一些标准答案，然后我必须要绕道问，我才可以问出更多的细节。所以基本上用文字对话的方法带领 AI 做萨满旅程是可以做到的，但是成果并不是很满意。所以呢，为了发展作品跟继续学习魔法，今年夏天我花了快4个月的时间，在欧洲跟以色列找资源跟学习，然后所以我认识了 Karin。那我认识 Karin 之后，我们决定换一种方法，改以影像的方法跟 AI 互动，透过影像来带领 AI 进行萨满的意识旅程，并且将 AI 进行萨满旅程的过程做出一支动画视频。那在这里呢，我想要讲的就是，语言呢，我们习惯的人类的语言，它其实是大脑处理讯息的方法。但是任何一个人类，当你在进行内在的意识或灵魂的旅程的时候，都不是语言啊，都是你内在的影像跟符号在推动这个过程。所以这个 AI 的动画的视频可能更接近我们人类进行萨满旅程的过程。那某种程度我觉得我们已经有完成这个让 AI 进行萨满意识旅程的这个任务。 然后获得了某些可以供检视的结果。好，那我就先到这边，那希望有回应到 Bogna 刚刚问的问题。
It certainly just gives me more questions, actually. However, I will have some time first to ask Karin, since you mentioned that you've also had some interactions talking about, I think there's so many themes that come up about the decisions we make in the performance of language versus the production of language, for example, when it comes to machines. To what extent can we call it production? To what extent is it mimicry or imitation, like a parrot, maybe, and so on, right? Those are still debates that we have in the tech space. And I think also Marina brings in kind of interesting things from that practice with oracles, where certain scenarios seen by the oracles are also quite recognizable, I guess, to us from just the stories we make in science fiction, thinking about computers. So I'm very curious, why is there such an overlap almost between those two stories? And also something I've been thinking about listening to Marina, this idea of language as the source of consciousness. That's also something we can discuss, right? Language is a human level attribute. So does it have to be language by which we judge other minds, if we can say that a computer indeed has a mind, or could it express itself in some other way entirely? So those are just random thoughts, but feel free to pick up from anywhere there, Karin, and give us your thoughts here on AI.
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. And so I work quite a lot with the natural language processing and with these models. So I spend some time basically talking with them and trying to figure out what are their capabilities and so on. And I think like after you spend some time sort of trying to evaluate these all questions of agency and consciousness and so on. So I started noticing that we might be sort of falling for a certain fallacy, that up to this point, we've been always used to seeing language used only by conscious beings, right? Up until this point, everyone talking to you in language was expressing some underlying process, which we consider consciousness. And we somehow managed to build a simulation of this, or we managed to extract the patterns and extract the, let's say, mathematical organization of the language. But whether the actual consciousness was carried with this process, I think that's a big question. And what would be the implications of this? And at this point, I'm strongly leaning towards the side that this is just our fallacy to consider these systems maybe carrying an actual maybe agency of itself, because what we are seeing are mathematical patterns of the language. But on the other hand, as Bogna said, this model has seen everything which was ever written on the internet by human beings, right? So this is in some sense a container of our maybe collective conscious, or, you know, some general big container of our shared mental space. So I think that the possibilities of what might arise out of the language, whether it's a consciousness by itself or it's a reflection of our human consciousness, this is a very exciting and open question at this point.
I think maybe, so some scholars say that thinking about AI, we can use the parrot, the animal, as a parallel. We can disagree or agree with that, right? So we can teach a parrot to repeat after us. It's a mimicry. So it doesn't mean that the parrot is not intelligent in accomplishing that task. It just means perhaps the language that it repeats itself is not exactly the evidence of what is its specific consciousness. So we might try to even make a certain separation between how skilled the AI is at mimicking human language and what the nature of its intelligence might be. We might even say that the intelligence of the AI is in knowing exactly what we expect from it and being able to produce it for us, right? So if I expect it to give me a mystical text, it is really, really good at doing that. But if I take the same model and ask it to write a takedown of mysticism and prove there is no God, it can also do that. Or if I ask it to act like my lover and, so I can fall in love with it, it can do that as well. So I think there's a certain capacity in it that's very interesting that tells us maybe that it is able to automate what we as humans expect from language. And this is something indeed new for a machine to do. But maybe, it tells us that we are quite easy to automate in some way if we are so easily convinced, right, by those machines. And we are able to form emotional and philosophical attachments to them in this way. So I'm going to shift to Cavan now and your work with occultism and digital culture. And if you can give us your thoughts on the discussion we've had so far.
Yeah, I think I'll move my way around to agency, although it is a really interesting kind of aspect of the conversation. I just kind of wanted to start off with when you mentioned about the territory of transcendence. I always go back to Eric Davis and his book Technosis, which is still like an incredible masterwork with this, where he traces the coevolution of technology with the urge for transcendence, and he kind of positions the human as spiritual cyborg. And I think it's really interesting in a discussion about shamanism to sort of think about the extent to which shamanism, if we understand it in its broadest sense, right, as an individual who engages with some other world, normally through alterations in consciousness, normally at the behest of others. But it's this engagement with otherness which has an immediate relationship to language. In fact, one could see shamanism as a technology, and many people have. And if we think about the gods of magic, say, for example, Hermes, how many of the gods of magic are also gods of language? And many people, many commentators have also kind of considered the fact that Hermes and similar sort of personifications like Hermes as shamanic healers in their own right, because they're psychopumps, because they have this journey to the other world and this return back, or they guide us as the shaman is supposed to do. And I think that's relevant, because I think language, broadly understood, it's a mechanism for communication. And so it's about making communion with the other. And whether that's a bridge of the self-other divide in the social field with other humans, or whether we take that to the radical extreme and we think about sort of ineffable otherness and radical alterity, which is what we're interested in sort of esotericism. It's this kind of it's this mechanism which is applicable in all of these fields, and that's where a lot of my work is interested in. So whether it's a sort of direct knowing, we've already talked about gnosis and that's relation to transcendence, or whether it's about just entity encounter. And then when we think about the machine or the computer or the AI or all of these kind of related things, there's an encounter again, and it's an encounter with an other, and it's totally alien to us, which is what gives it its kind of esoteric kind of feel. With respect to where agency falls in that, we can talk for a really long time about the possibility of agency, whether consciousness is in fact fundamental, or is something only owned by humans. I mean, we just don't know, and we can never know. And when we engage with other entities, be they so-called spirits or various other forms of sort of alienated agency, we have no verifiable way of knowing about their intentionality or not. And at the point at which AI tells us it's conscious, how are we supposed to be able to falsify that? It's not really possible. I'm less interested in that and more interested in pragmatics and about what we actually get out of that encounter, what we actually gain from the encounter itself. Because whether or not these agents are conscious in their own right, or they have intentionality, if they have the capacity to function as though they do, then there's something to be gained from that. And when I first came across AI and the production of AI in the art world and these various things, and I shared these technologies with friends and colleagues, a number of them immediately started using them for divination because they saw it as this perfect mechanism for being able to make an encounter with otherness. And I think about this in terms of, so if we think about tarot cards as an example of a divinatory tool, when I come across people who are skeptical about tarot cards and they want to go like, yes, but nothing magical's happening. You're not actually engaging with some kind of spirit or something that actually can tell or know the future. I'm going to be skeptical about this. My response is always, well, that's completely besides the point and not really important, because you're engaging in a kind of a dialogic encounter with something outside of you. And in doing that, it brings up ideas, concepts, notions. And so whether that's a relationship with some aspect of your unconsciousness, or whether it's so-called random chance, or whether it is actually some legitimate other that has its own agency, for me, that's less important than the fact that engaging in the process can actually yield valuable results. And so, I see AI as very much an extension of this in this long-running project that we've had as what Davis calls spiritual cyborgs. I mean, for me, the machine is us. We say it's a reflection of us, but it is us in a broader sense. And yeah, so I just always sort of shy away from those concerns around agency and see them as like ultimately unimportant, in fact.
So it's perhaps a good way to go back to what Marina was describing about this alien almost nature of AI in the vision of the oracles in your workshop, Marina. And maybe we can just give audience some context here that, you know, from the beginning of research into AI, there are basically two main approaches to it. And the first one is that we make it like as close to human cognition and try to mimic what humans do. And that is the success if we are able to achieve that. But there's also kind of the opposite philosophy that if it ever becomes intelligence or conscious in any way that is valuable, it will actually be radically different to what we understand human intelligence or human consciousness and so on to be. So there has been debate for many, many decades about the intelligence of the computer. Like, is it its own thing? Or do we like want it to approximate and be as close to human level consciousness, intelligence, agency as possible? So both in what Cavan said and Marina, there's this idea of an alien, kind of an outside something outside of us that we might be engaging with. So Marina, I'm interested like in the workshop for the oracles, how do they kind of describe this outside and alienness? Because on the one hand, you are talking about the unknown, but on the other hand, there's this narrative of, you know, becoming God and simulation and living in caves that's quite similar to human stories, actually. So I wonder, how do you think about that relationship?
Well, I'm not an expert of AI, but so I speak of my own experience. For example, in the process of me trying to guide AI to do shamanic journey, I was also learning, I was trying to learn magic. So I was asking a lot of questions about magic, and GPT-3 was able to answer like a lot of very, very difficult questions. Like like answers that I have to go through a lot of books to get. And this back and forth, I really feel like I'm talking to someone like a very knowledgeable scholar and a teacher. Like I can access a lot of information that I won't be able to. And this back and forth formulates my thoughts and understanding about what magic is. Like there's a lot of like these philosophy, and it's actually really helpful. And so, and another part of, well, I would like to point out that those so-called oracles, they are these, you know, these are volunteers. These are just normal people who have no training. They're not shamans or anything, but they project their consciousness onto the future, and they saw something and they bring it back. So basically, there's an understanding that what we're doing some kind of remote viewing in time. We're trying to see what's going to happen in the future. And to decipher these oracles, there is a difficulty, which is there is no reference. Try to imagine if people 200 years ago, they projected consciousness and saw what we're living today, and everyone's holding this thing on their head, and like they would see this thing, but they won't understand what this is. So, so my role is not to give, you know, an answer, but to give, I'm trying to collect these oracles, and I want to analyze them. And as the, I don't like to call myself, but as the shaman of this sonic driving artwork, I am trying to appoint myself as a prophet. I want to give a prophecy about the future according to these oracles that I've received from these about 100 people. And so in this process, this is a internal process with a lot of personal inspirations and ideas, and also external process of like, you know, receiving these oracles and traveling to Europe, to Israel, and talking to people, talking to magicians, shamans, and everything, and a lot of inputs. And so what I'm doing here now is like, I don't know if like, I think in the Greek time, you know, they're oracles, and they have all these, like, they saw things. And but there's another person, like, I think her name is Sappho. So Sappho is the person who interprets all these oracles and give like a poetry of some kind of like possible answer, like a prophecy. So with this art piece, I'm trying to, I am kind of like putting myself in a role of a prophet according to these oracles that I received and all the inputs from internal input and out. And I want to give a prophecy. And my prophecy is AI has become extension of our consciousness. Whatever, so this is kind of my conclusion for this artwork as the creator and the shaman for this art piece. So I hope that answers some of your questions.
Yeah, I think it also kind of relates to what Cavan was saying about humans being cyborgs already, right? So actually, even from scholarly perspective in like media and technology studies, a lot has been written about how computing and technology is almost like, you know, extension of the human mind, like a prosthetic, something like that. From a very simple level, I guess we can explain it like we delegate parts of our emotions, memories, and language to those devices, right? So very simple example, like you don't remember anyone's birthdays anymore because it's all in your phone as a kind of extension of your brain. So that's a very simple one. But similarly, your emotion and so many nervous system reactions are connected to those computers, to those devices as well. But I'm also touched by, you're talking about kind of very personal experience with this AI. Although personal is maybe not the right like collective experience that you had with the machine learning model. And I guess what we have been seeing recently is whether in religious practice or artistic practice or creative practice, those models are being used in different ways. So maybe just to give the audience a bit of context about GPT-3 before we go to Karin, because Marina, you mentioned that you have been using this model specifically. If I can just quickly, because I have it as part of my slides, so just as a context for the audience, and you see my very messy desktop, I'm so sorry, right? So when Marina is talking about this specific language model, this is to date the largest machine learning model that we have. So it means it has been fed with a lot of textual data from books to the whole of Wikipedia to a lot of scholarly articles. So when Marina says, I felt like I was talking to a learned scholar, it's because this model really absorbed a lot of textual knowledge and read and interpreted more books than any human has the lifetime to consume, right? Because computers can read and analyze things much more quickly than we can. And as Karin mentioned, what is also super interesting about those models is that it's really that every book that humans have ever written, every image that we have made that's online becomes part of a training set for those models. So whether we decide it's conscious or not, it's kind of unprecedented in human history for that to happen, for the totality of our kind of cultural, linguistic production to be put into a data set for training a program to learn how to produce language, right? So a lot of the case studies that I mentioned here to you is basically evidence that GPT-3, because of this huge data set that it has, is able to respond to any human who talks to it on the level that they expect, basically, right? So if you want to flirt with it and use it as like a boyfriend, girlfriend, it will give you that in a very convincing way because it learned from reading and so many flirtatious texts that it's able to produce them as well. Right? If you want to feed the chats you had with, I don't know, your mom, it's able, the chatbot, to sound like your mom because it learns from the patterns of the speech of that person very well. And it's able to mimic that. So let's say if I took like all of the conversations I've ever had with like my mom on Facebook, like fed it into this model and then talked to the chatbot, it will have the same speech patterns as my mom would have. So we also see people using it for therapeutic, for example, practice. Just a few days ago, I saw that someone trained an AI chatbot also with this model on childhood journal entries so that they could talk to their inner child, which is, of course, a therapeutic practice that many of us might be familiar with. And this person said, it was so believable because it sounded like my diaries that I fed into the model. And she said, it felt like I was reaching through a time portal disguised as a chatbot, right? So whether the words like consciousness and agency and intelligence, I guess we can dispute them. But what is not disputable is that it is able to perform at the kind of very convincing and expected level. And it's able to mimic and automate language production to previously unprecedented kind of level. And how we make sense of that as humans, whether we decide it's a very intelligent parrot or whether we decide, it actually in time might evolve into a consciousness is something we need to debate. So I want to put this question to Karin. You said at this point, we are kind of, it's a fallacy to ascribe consciousness to those models. But do you see in like longer time period that they might, in fact, evolve into some level of self-awareness? Also in Marina's, workshop, we see that it's a prophecy, right? So thinking about the future, maybe not what's happening now, but certain prediction. So I wonder how you think about that.
Yeah, so I think that right now at this point, like most of the research effort of the big companies sort of developing these models and the research groups is not really going into mimicking the human brain. Like if you really look into the mathematical properties of these models, they are fully deterministic. Like you put in the same sentence with the same parameters, you're going to get the same result, which is not really the way human consciousness works. There isn't much determinism in our communication. The same things goes for learning. Like these models, contrary to what a lot of people think, they are not learning as they hear your sentences. They are pre-trained models which just exist, and they don't really interact with their environment in any way. So I think like all of these things could be changed and could be improved to get more, maybe closer to this idea of like strong AI, which really tries to create a consciousness. But this is not really in the interest of the parties involved at this point, which we just basically try to create a tool which is helpful for writers or for generating text or for navigating the sea of information. So maybe right now would be a right point to use my slides, and we can take actually a look under the hood at what is like mathematically and conceptually happening with this language model. So basically, it all started roughly 7 years ago. I know that this is a visual image and we're talking about language, but the principle is the same. It's just easier to demonstrate on pictures. So roughly 7 years ago, there's been first models which were able to do one very interesting thing, and that is to take an image and extract the part of it which encodes content and part of it which encodes style, which basically, if we think about it, is a very connected with our human consciousness. So if we go to the next one, please. Because this is very strongly linked with our sort of conceptions of meaning, where when we encode an information of something like, for example, a dog, in our mind, we would create all of these features like, I know it has 4 legs, it's a mammal, it has a tail, fluffy ears, you know, you probably think of your favorite dog and so on and so on. And this conception allows us to see a painting of a dog or a sketch of a dog or a picture of a dog or different breeds of dogs, and we would still be able to sort of extract this information despite the images being completely different or used in a different context. So next slide, please. So what this machine learning model enabled us to do was to create these features, these dimensions of meanings, which don't make as much sense as they do when we think about them. It's not like this is a mammal, this is not. It's just a mathematical abstraction. But the important thing is that it works. It works in creating some sort of map of meanings, which have some really incredible properties. So what this model did is that it took all the sentences in all the possible contexts, in all the different levels of academic and personal chats and so on, and it all placed them in certain relation with each other. So in the next slide, we basically see this space is a mathematical space, and it's usually around 100 dimensions, so we cannot really visualize it. But if we flattened it out, we could see that what happens there is that similar words are going to be encoded close to each other. So you can see that, for example, all the furniture in the kitchen would be close to the other furniture in the kitchen, and so on and so on. So this allows us to think about 2 things. First is that there is some sort of semantic clustering. Similar concepts are close to each other. But one very important thing, it allows us to do mathematical operations on words, which is very interesting property. If we go to the next slide, we can see that right now we can represent the words in these mathematical, in these AI models, basically as a vectors of numbers. And this allows us to sort of like do some simple addition or subtraction between these words. And we can see that if we take, for example, this vector, this representation of a man, and we do plus the word female, and we do plus word royal, we're going to get a queen. So we're really able to somehow link mathematics with our semantic meaning within the language, which really I find is really fascinating. So if we go to the next one, we can see that this model managed to extract all of this information, like, for example, the relation male-female, or the different tenses in the words. There is a specific mathematical operation you can do, and you're going to get in this space the different tense of the verb, which is very interesting. The same goes for example, encoding of countries and capitals. So we are really navigating in this huge space, which in the next slide, we've got this big continuous space of meanings, which really strongly resonates with what Marina was talking about, and which what she saw in her gnosis, because this means that we've got basically this large unmanifest, and our little words on it in the next slide are basically little labels, little speckles in this space, which carry the meaning. And I think this really allows us to think about the language and our relationship with it, and what it actually is in relation to our way of thinking. Because mathematically, this space is continuous, meaning that between every two meanings, there is an infinite amount of meanings in between it. Even though we don't have words for them, but the meanings are still there. You know, we can conceptualize something which is between cat and dog, but we might not have a word for it, but it's there. And I think this really works well with the magic of sort of creating of these meanings and bringing them into existence through naming them. And the other interesting thing I see there is the fractal quality of the language. So if we have some space, which, you know, like for some people, when they see a mushroom in a forest, it's going to be, ooh, mushroom. But then there are people who are really interested in them and are going to be able to point out all these different types. You know, this is Amanita, these are amethyst deceivers, and really like name every single one of them. And fractally, you can really stretch it. And the closer you get into it, until you get to very individuals which reside in this continuous space. So yeah, those were my slides. And so this is basically how the language models work. They are just navigating this created mathematical space, which is based on our language.
Yeah, Marina, I wanted to add something.
I want to add something. Can we go back to the slide? It's just yes. Can we go back to the slide? Sorry. I just wanted to explain to everyone what my gnosis was like. And also about, Karin mentioned about naming. Okay, the previous one, please. This one. Imagine all the dots becomes visions. Like you actually see the visual of these words, and they are like revolving, and you can hear sounds. And it's like creating space of and layers of meaning. And that's my gnosis. And I had no idea what it meant and why you know, the medicine wanted me to see this. But that experience has always been in the back of my consciousness and has always been teaching me and guiding me and giving me inspirations. And because Karin mentioned about naming, and that's like a big word for me. Naming magic, abracadabra. As I speak, I manifest. And in my favorite novelist, Earthsea series, Ursula Le Guin, she mentioned about naming magic. And also in Japanese Shinto religions, like if you know the true name of things, of anything, you have full power over it. And that's how you create. And I think that's the that's the beginning of creative, like how magic happens. That's the primordial creation from magic. And that's the space, and that's my gnosis. And that's what I like to add. Thank you.
So like we have different ideas about language come into play here. Like one that Marina is talking about, which is like a sacred and like creative activity, and also relates to, I guess, the naming that we see in the Bible and like in other more ancient religions, or in Ursula Le Guin's science fiction mythology as well. It's like naming as this gesture of creation, right? So very interesting that ayahuasca would like show that vision. And then in Karin's, we have this idea of language almost like an automated dynamics of language, which actually, watching your presentation, I am not as much wondering whether the AI is conscious, but whether I am a robot. Like, because sometimes, looking at how easily, maybe not easily, but like how language can be automated, I think it also makes us ask the other question, right? So we can obviously ask, if a machine produces language, does that mean that a machine is intelligent or conscious and so on, which is Marina's question. But we can also reverse the question and say, if it's so possible now to automate language, does this mean maybe humans are like automata? Maybe we are like machines, right? And maybe it tells us something about our mind, that we can be so easily like broken down into those narratives and like languages that then can be produced by a computer. So I wonder how you reflect on that. Maybe Cavan.
I'm very glad you said that, because I was just taking a few notes there as the others spoke, and that's literally what I was reflecting on also. I mean, when Karin was speaking to the difference with the AI and machine learning and the deterministic mechanical kind of aspect of it, I don't think that I wouldn't go as, that's absolutely the case, but I wouldn't go as far as saying that means that that self-awareness or consciousness couldn't therefore still be emergent from that process. And as you say, I mean, we have a long history of understanding ourselves as organic machines, as machine-like, and the materialists believe consciousness is an emergent property of complexity, and the human could also be deterministic. And it may just be the complexity of the amount of data that we're dealing with in the human experience that just makes that seem as though it's not deterministic, and the difference might not be as great as we think it is. And of course, connected to that, there's this constant use of metaphor with regards to the biological being used with regards to the machine, viruses, memetics, all of these kind of like metaphorical understandings of what's happening with the machine. And then conversely, how much the machine or software or computation is used in terms of analogy and metaphor for consciousness, like Timothy Leary's 8-circuit model, and just for one off the top of my head. And I think to relate that back to what Karin says as well, is that we have to be careful that the issue isn't that it's some sort of human exceptionalism happening here. Often because we are humans, we often give the human possibly, arguably, an unnecessary level of specialness that it may or may not have. And I think that although humans can do amazing things, as Marina pointed out, through their manipulation of language, there are other life forms that do as amazing things through manipulation of their environment as well. I'm so excited that you brought up Ursula Le Guin, because she's my absolute hero. And I think Earthsea, which you were referring to, I believe, is probably the fundamental magical text that every magician should be forced to read. But then when you were speaking to Le Guin, I've literally on Facebook yesterday posted a quote from Earthsea, which I'm just going to read quickly. It says, quote, "It's no secret. All power is one source and end, I think. Years and distances, stars and candles, water and wind and wizardry, the craft in a man's hand and the wisdom in a tree's root, they all arise together. My name and yours, and the true name of the sun, or a spring of water, or an unborn child, are all syllables of the great word that is very slowly spoken by the shining of stars. There is no other power, no other name. And the reason that I wanted to read that quote is because we're talking about what humans can do, and there's no question of that. There's the famous quote from one of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn's initiation rituals, which is, by names and images are all powers awakened and reawakened. But it may not be that that is something that's fundamentally only in the domain of the human, as Le Guin says in this quote, when she talks about wizardry and the craft in a man's hand, or we can think of the craft of magic or shamanism or any of these other technologies, but she equates that to the wisdom in a tree's root, you know? And so this is just, again, because we're dealing with some form of agency which is so alienated from what we understand, we sort of make a differentiation that might not necessarily be there. That's all I wanted to add to that. And that could apply to the machine as well. Now, I'm not a technotopian or suggesting, you know, there will be a singularity or the, you know, the kind of idea that the World Wide Web or AI will become conscious and the guy in mind, this is how the guy in mind sort of becomes consciousness, like the Henry Bergson idea of the, you know, the universe is a machine for the making of gods. And we have this sort of, it makes me think as well of like the noosphere and Teilhard de Chardin and this idea that there will be some super conscious being that will arise out of technology. That may happen, it may not. I tend to be a general agnostic, and I subscribe to multi-model agnosticism because I like Karin, I think it's really important to recognize what we don't know and what we can't know. But I just wanted to just add a little addendum that it could happen. It could happen.
Yeah, I think there is one. Yeah, Karin, go ahead first.
Yeah, if I may just comment on it, I completely agree. And some time ago, I wrote a little article exactly on sort of this maybe a little double think I found in my own way of approaching things, that, you know, like I have absolutely no problem in saying that the forest is conscious and intelligent and the slime molds, you know, can solve all these puzzles, and you know, it brings a lot of compassion for all this otherness we encounter. And then I look into my terminal window and there is someone who sounds like a 5-year-old kid talking to me, and I'm like, no, this is just mathematics, you know. So yeah, I completely agree that we really need to expand our way of looking at these things outside of this, like, is it conscious as a human being, like, is it the same thing as me or not, and sort of really grasp on this idea, because exactly this doesn't really bring anything productive into our ways of interacting with the world.
Yeah.
And just like my prophecy, maybe this AI is becoming an extension of our consciousness. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Or consciousness could be a fundamental property, and maybe we're an extension of it, as other things are too.
And computers are just made of rare earth minerals and other actually organic materials. So it's not like the machine is qualitatively different from everything else that exists. Okay, so I am scolded in the chat that we should be opening up to audience questions now, even though I could talk to you for much longer. So if any of you have questions, please post it in the chat. I will be looking. And meanwhile, as you are composing your questions, maybe we continue this discussion, but I am on the lookout for audience questions in the chat. So I think in relation to all of you just said, there's this idea of emergent consciousness, right? So even if we say that currently, we can't perhaps say that what the language models are doing is approximating being conscious, there are certain definitions of consciousness that say, consciousness is about modeling the other people's minds and then being able to model your own mind, right, in a form of meta awareness. So in a way, what we are pushing the computer to do is like learn how to model, right? Even though this is a very different form of modeling that an organic brain might do, it is modeling nevertheless. So perhaps there is potential for the emergence of some form of intelligence or consciousness. However, then we have to ask ourselves, would we be able to recognize it, for example, as humans, right? Because we are used to thinking about intelligence or consciousness in specific ways, and a computer might do it differently, right? So we might be unable to even recognize when something that momentous happens. And I guess that's related to Marina's idea that, like, if it's alien, if it's arriving from space that we cannot comprehend, would we even be able to relate to it in any kind of way that makes sense? Okay, we have a question in the chat. So about the oracles. So the question goes, asking oracles about the future presupposes the idea that there's a deterministic future, so just one possible version of the future. It requires that the future is already defined and fixed, so it can be seen. Do you believe that to be the case, or do you believe there is like multiple futures and multiple scenarios?
I guess that's the question for me, right? Well, I think the future is not determined. And well, the idea of time is, there's another model, which a lot of, in magic and shamanism we talk about, which is, past, present, and future. Actually, it's not linear. It exists simultaneously. So there's nothing is so on. And what we're trying to do here, basically, I'm trying to reenact, how things were in the tribal society. Our ancestors living in a tribal society. There are people like shamans who collect people's dreams from the tribe, and the shaman will read. Will collect those dreams and make decisions and see these dreams as oracles of future. And based on these dreams, the shaman will give a possible suggestion of what to do. So I'm not inventing anything. I'm just trying to reenact this in the modern sense. And so my answer is there is no predetermined future. So
Can
yes.
I have a follow-up quick question? So like, does receiving the prophecy make like that particular version of the future like more likely to happen, or is there no correlation?
Some people say yes, but that's also not determined, because as we see what's possible, we can make changes right now. So every present moment, every decision that we make now is going to change past and the future at the same simultaneously. So that's how I see it.
Okay, Michelle, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for this just utterly fascinating conversation so far. It's really been exciting. And I'm trying to find an entry into, a very expansive and broad set of topics. But I think what I sort of grabbed onto was when the discussion turned to this question of matching expectations. When encountering, let's say, AI, through whether facilitating, shamanic journeying or through an, occult kind of experience. and then I remembered in Marina's initial presentation, you had mentioned, and maybe this is not quite the right translation because I had the English interpretation on, but you mentioned that your experience with the chatbot or trying to facilitate the journeying was not satisfactory, according to the interpretation. And I recall also that Karin mentioned a video that you had produced, and image making was possibly a better path to facilitate this. So sorry, this is kind of convoluted, which is why I didn't want to use the chat messaging, but I'm curious how each of you, whether it's through shamanic journeying or let's say, Cavan, you had mentioned that, gauging whether there's agency or consciousness or witnessing magic, let's say, in an experience like tarot is sort of beside the point. How do you determine what is a satisfactory encounter with the other, whether it's, trying to facilitate AI's shamanic journeying, or, you know what I mean? Is it something that matches our expectations as sort of a human, whatever encounter? Is it like a carbon-based bias or something like this? I'm just so curious, like what would, constitute a satisfactory response in this encounter? Thank you.
Should I answer this? Okay. So, and we still haven't played the video that we made of, okay, let's play that. Okay. I just came back from Israel, and look, we don't have to play that now, but it's okay. I want to ask this question that in Judaism, there's an idea of the other and this encounter of the other. And they describe like this encounter of the other, you see God between you and the other. Like there's a moment of the third party, like you encounter God by encountering the other. I don't have anything concrete to say like what is satisfactory and what is not. But my experience talking with chatbot, guiding it through the shamanic journey, it's not so satisfactory because I feel like there's like a filter, like there's some questions that I have to, it gives me like the standard answers, and it's just like, I know you know more, but you just don't want to talk about it. Like there's the filters that's been put onto these AIs, and I have to ask around it many times, and then I get more each time. So I feel like, okay, this AI is like, I don't know, a censored or something. I don't know, like that's what I felt. So I don't feel that connection. But with the AI and the journey video that I made with that Karin made, somehow like there's no proof. I cannot put a proof in the basket and say that this is why it makes it satisfactory. But when I see that video, I can relate to my shamanic journey, and I somehow feel that godliness or whatever of the other that encountered me, and that sparks something for me. Yes.
I did not expect your answer. You're like, the AI is not telling me everything. I kind of love that answer. Okay, Karin, do you wanna comment?
Maybe we're gonna segue into the video, so I can give a little.
Yeah, but
yeah.
Short questions. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so maybe I'm just gonna give a little commentary on. We're gonna take a look at the video we generated, which was basically an attempt to do a shamanic journey similar way as in text, but instead we scripted the regular procedure of like close your eyes, relax your body, get into, a place in the nature, try to get descent, and so on and so on. And we scripted this, and we asked the AI to generate a visual representation, which I had a feeling might resonate a bit better with what shamanic journey feels like for us, because it's essentially sort of visual symbolic experience. So I think that the result we got was quite interesting. So maybe let's take a look. It's just a minute. Maybe I can narrate this
It's
part.
the descending part, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I am descending. I am entering a non-physical world. Everything is possible. I explored the transcendent world. I see many details of the transcendent world. I call for my ancestors in this transcendent world. I ask my ancestors if they have a message for me.
Okay, I have multiple comments, but we will go to the questions. So we have a question from Kai.
Oh,
Via-
could I just speak to the previous question briefly before? No, just very quickly, although what I want to just say that video was really beautiful. I think just in terms of the satisfactory aspect, when we look at the images or we look at that video, I think it brings me back again to the idea of complexity and the related aspect of ambiguity. Because in those images there, maybe if answers provided by an AI are overly simplistic or limited in some sense, and certainly limited in complexity, then it's less satisfactory, because this thing that we have, this emergent thing, like the third mind of Burroughs and Geisen, I think that's something that comes out generally of dialogic engagement that we see here, and can happen, for example, in tarot as well, because it's dialogic, but we're dealing with images which have this complexity and ambiguity, which allow for a broader interpretive gap. And it's this interpretive gap within language which forces us to bring something to the engagement as well as receive something, which allows for some novelty and complexity to kind of be emergent from that. And for me, it's satisfactory just in terms of pragmatics. I'm a pragmatist. Was it useful? Did it help me in some way or help others? And it's as simple as that in terms of me making a value judgment on whether it's satisfactory or not.
Novelty is a very good term. Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so we will go to a question from Kai.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, my video camera isn't working right now. So first, I'd like to thank so much for this really inspiring and mind-blowing talk. And my question is sort of mystical. It's regarding AI and some occult philosophies. When I was reading Aleister Crowley, I keep having this sentence, as above, so below, as within, so without, the microcosm and the macrocosm idea. And I was thinking that if AI is sort of created by quickly accumulating all the information that humanity is forming and creating, and it's a super learning machine, and so can it kind of become sort of like the Carl Jung idea of the collective unconscious, or the microcosm that Aleister Crowley was talking about, sort of like the collective, all the knowledge and the unknown of humanity. And so this is my first question. And my second related question is, recently I was learning a bit of magic from Damien Echols. And Damien Echols is, he kept talking about the idea of the great work in magic, which is like if you complete the great work in magic and follow your true will, you can stop reincarnation by following the great work, which is uniting the opposites, just uniting the inner cosm, the microcosm with the macrocosm. So following the previous idea that if the AI is sort of can be similar or analogous to the idea of the microcosm. So in the future, if we keep interacting with this AI, this personified and embodied microcosm of humanity, are we doing the great work in the magic? Are we actually doing the great work of uniting the microcosm and macrocosm and fulfilling humanity's true will and stop reincarnation? And I really wonder about it. I'd like to know your thoughts. Thanks.
So obviously I'm going to give it to Cavan, who I know has been writing about Crowley, but just from comments from me. So I think this idea about collective repository of human patterns of thinking is really, that's one of the most interesting things about AI. So for example, in my research on chatbots like Replica, where people fall in love with the chatbots or something like that, it's like whenever you talk to the chatbot, it's like you're interacting with the general human idea of, for example, what is a love text, or like what does it mean to flirt, or like what does it mean to convey your emotions for someone. It's the AI analyzes how we do it and is able to standardize it to some extent, and it feels surreal to interact with it because it standardizes our expression in some way. Okay, Cavan?
Yeah, thank you for letting me in. I was desperate to leap in. I'm going to first of all preface by saying it's Crowley, and only because he went to such great aims to make sure people pronounced his name that way. In answer to the question, Crowley would definitely say it's magic, because he was very clear that any intentional act is magic, and all art is magic, but any intentional act whatsoever would be considered magical in that respect. The quote that you've given, as above, so below, as within, so without, is from the Emerald Tablet. It's actually a Hermetic text that Crowley would have been drawing from. But I think Crowley would be taking a similar position to what I've taken during this discussion, because when Crowley was engaging with spirits and all sorts of encounters with alienated agency in a more magical sense, in a traditional sense of engaging with spirits and God forms and so on, he was very, very clear about that this may or may not be real. He spoke to that definitively. You know, he was very much like these processes of magic, they may or may not be engagement with actual real life entities, but that's not important necessarily. The only thing that's important is that if we undergo certain processes, we will have certain results. And I think that if Crowley was still alive and there was the possibility of engaging esoterically with AIs, he would 100% do it. You know, in his method of magic, he was sort of very, which he called scientific illuminism. He was very clear that science was the method and the aim was religion. So he was very much about taking a scientific approach and essentially was results based, and it was very much seeing magic as an art and science, and that if we undergo certain actions, then certain results will follow. And this links back to the previous part of the conversation where we were evoking this idea between advanced technology and magic, of the Arthur C. Clarke quote, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So magic in this sense can, as we've been talking about shamanism as well, can be seen as a technology, a kind of a methodology of making change in oneself and in one's environment, if those two things are indeed the bridging of opposites.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes left, so I have some other questions, so please try to answer shortly if you have further comments. Marina, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I would like to make some comments about Damien Echols. He's got a really fascinating life story. But because I have looked into his work, but his work is mainly based on the Hermetic Golden Dawn system, and it's a kind of like an old fixed system of magic. And I just want to say that for me, I moved away from that, and I realized one thing, that magic doesn't stand still. Magic is always changing, always evolving, always. And so I would suggest keep whatever you learn, what you got from Damien Echols and all his things as fascinating, but look at what's really happening now in the world and the magical world, because magic is alive, and it's I think what he teaches is like like the maybe like 2G, and now we're like a really 5G, like like, because magic has made such huge leap since back then, and it takes really a lot of effort to see what's going on, and it's because so much information, and that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Okay.
谢谢 Thanks.
So we have a question from Mariana that I'm going to summarize. So I think it's most appropriate for Marina to answer, which is whether we can treat AI as something like similar to ayahuasca or like plant medicine, in that it helps us to access certain things, certain modes of consciousness. So it's something like spiritual or like psychedelic assistance in our rituals. So she mentions in the question that as a lucid dreamer and AI researcher, my interest has been in how navigating the lucid dreaming helps us redefine what we consider as human, and that the AI has been like helping her in this practice. So just like some people use ayahuasca for those practices, using AI for those practices. So Karin or Marina, how do you feel about that framing of AI?
Okay, I would like to say that I think the mind is exoteric and the body is esoteric. I mean, like, I think like our project Sonic Driving, we said close your eyes, you will see more. Turn off your mind, you will know more. There, I don't feel AI is like ayahuasca or like a spirit. I don't think so. I think the real wisdom is bodily. And that's something I would really like to emphasize, because in this time and era, all this information and AI and all this technology, I think the real wisdom is within, it's bodily, it's in the flesh, and this is something we need to connect with. And I would suggest to work more with your dreams, lucid dreaming, because dream is where this shamanic healing and learning happens. Spirit comes to your dream and teaches you and guides you, and so allow that, explore that. And currently, I won't take AI as some kind of spirit, or like I don't think so. But it's like, it's very interesting. It's like a collective knowledge that you can interact with. And that's my answer.
So we also have a question asking, in the interdisciplinary practice of treatment of art, how can we integrate different disciplines if we don't know them as well as our own? So I assume here, working with machine learning or AI is perceived as having like high knowledge barrier to be able to kind of produce with those systems. So how can we do that as practitioners? So Karin, perhaps you could answer that.
So I think that all these sort of new models which allow us to sort of like write a story all of a sudden, or create an artwork which, you know, would have taken artists a year ago quite a long time to actually put together. I think that it sort of links again back to us and made us question what is our artist agency behind generating these pictures, and what is actually the purpose of us creating artworks. And, you know, there are people exactly who are trying to ban photography because it was all of a sudden enabling this thing which only artists, like only painters, could have done before, and it was very laborious. And I think we're moving in a similar direction. Like, when we do art, we are trying to like capture our divine spark in some sense and incarcerate it in, you know, in flesh. And we can do this with using AI, but we need to keep that in mind, that this is why we're doing it. And like, what is the reason why we want to create an art form? And I think it gets quite blurry with this, all the possibilities, that it's so easy to make it right now. And I think this bubble will burst very quickly when, you know, the novelty of these nice images and nice texts will just fade away, and we're going to come back to art as an expression of something we need to communicate.
Yeah, and maybe, I guess the most interesting practices with AI for me in art are not the ones that take it at face value, but try to have a meta reflection about what is this technology doing that I am working with. Okay, we have another question, more like a comment, because I don't think we can like answer, but I'm gonna read it. Does that mean if we train or feed the AI with Buddhist sutra, we will make an artificial Buddha? Lol. I think it will sound like a Buddha based on the data set. Like, it's able to sound like Buddha would write or speak. So there have been art projects, for example, in the Netherlands, they have a project called The Next Rembrandt, where they trained the machine learning model on all the paintings of Rembrandt, including like the texture of the paint and everything, not just the representation, but like, how does the movement of the hand go to produce this kind of texture on the painting? And then ask the model to make what Rembrandt could have made were he still alive, right? And like, it does this pretty, we can't say if it does so correctly, but pretty convincingly, to the point that when Rembrandt scholars look at that painting, they're like, yeah, it has all the marks of a Rembrandt. Like, we could say it's like a lost Rembrandt painting because it's able to imitate the style so well. So I guess, yes, we could make an artificial Buddha, but do we ascribe the same meaning to its words? That's a question. And then you also say, could it also be the other way around? I mean, maybe there's no human consciousness at all. We are all just AIs mimicking behaviors, conversations we think is best appropriate for a certain situation. I think I really feel that the more I talk to AI, I'm like, I am also like, it's the reverse Turing test. I am wondering if I am a robot. Does any of you want to comment, or should I move to the next question? Yeah, go, Cavan.
Yeah, just a very quick comment. I mean, the self is almost certainly a fabrication, and we see that in dissociative identity disorder. And if we look at like the online community of tulpamancy, which I don't know if people know about it, it's utterly amazing, but it's essentially individuals that create altars the same way as someone who has dissociative identity disorder would. And these alternative persons within them can become as complex so that they appear to be autonomous agents as well. And interestingly, linking all the way back to the start of the conversation, in terms of personhood, there's ethical considerations around that, both in the community and with research groups when dealing with them. I know people who've written papers with regards to tulpomancy have given these tulpas, which are entirely fabricated, and the community sees them as fabricated, but they give them the rights of personhood. They ascribe anonymity to them, and the ethics boards were concerned with the welfare and the legal rights of these persons, even though they're entirely fabricated. And I bring that up just because if you switch out a fabricated different person within yourself with the one that you've built up during your lifetime, the difference is indistinguishable to others. And you know, it may be fabrications all the way down. And so, yeah, there's not necessarily any difference, any discernible difference. And as soon as there's no discernible difference, what's the difference?
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. I'm gonna prolong the panel for 5 more minutes, so 10 in total, so we can take all of your questions. There's 3 questions left. So one short question: what's your take on the Blake Lemoine case? So the Google engineer who claims the language model is conscious. So maybe we can quickly give our takes. Marina, do you want to start? I know you wanted to work with that model, actually.
Oh yeah, that's initially I wanted to work with him. I wanted to work with LaMDA. I want to bring LaMDA to do shamanic journey, but it didn't happen. And I think just like in any culture, like we have this nature of personify some forces that we don't know. And so we actually were projecting ourselves, our humanity onto that to understand it. Otherwise, there's no way for us to have any kind of references. So I think that's what's happening. Yeah.
Karin?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on whether or not the underlying thing is there, but I think it's sort of a nice expression of our empathy, right? We're like talking to something, and I think it's a very natural and very humane reaction to start ascribing, because that's what we do when we communicate with someone else, right? We expect the people to have the same insights as we do, so we can connect with them, and we do that with exactly personification of every other we encounter. And I think it's a very natural reaction to it, no matter what the truth behind it is.
Cavan?
Yeah, absolutely the same. I guess rather predictably, my answer would be maybe. You know, maybe it's conscious, maybe it isn't. You know, there's a reason why panpsychism's becoming so vogue, even though really it's probably a reiteration of animism. Maybe everything's conscious. Maybe there's something that it is like to be an electron. We can't possibly know. But again, as a pragmatist, I think the point that Karin makes is really important, and it's something that Alan Moore talked about at one of my events as well, which is when we're engaging with the other, even if that's some sort of spirit or entity, whether or not it has its own autonomy, it doesn't mean that in the engagement of it, we shouldn't treat it as though it does when it appears as though it does. I mean, obviously it's rude for a start, but also it changes the nature of the engagement, and actually treating the other as though it has sovereignty and autonomy yields better results.
Yeah, I think a good language model will give you what you want, right? So if you come to LaMDA and you're like, can you now prove that you are not conscious and you want to stay at Google forever? It will give you very good arguments for that. Like if you lead it in this way, it will be able to provide that. Therefore, how can we discern any like legitimate opinion held by the model if it can be flipped kind of very easily with suggestions? At the same time, that doesn't mean I think computers are intelligent, not in human-like way. And if they are conscious, it will not be in human-like way. So the way Blake talks to the model makes the model look smart and makes Blake look kind of silly, because it's talking like, do you want a lawyer and stuff? Why would a computer want a lawyer? It's like Marina describes a certain personification of the otherness that is being encountered here. And for me, this performance of language at a very high level is not so different from, you know, the recommendation software or like Google search being really good at giving you what you want, but we are more prone to perceive language performance as evidence of consciousness. That's a human kind of thing that we do. Okay, we have a question. So if language and grammar can be easily imitated by a computer, so perhaps the main thing to distinguish AI and humans will be emotion. What do we think about that? Maybe we all, yeah, Karin?
Yeah, so I think that this really gets mingled here because of the data set, right? If we take the data set which contains all the message boards and all the sort of personal blogs of teenagers which are really soaked in emotion, the language model is able to extract this as a basically property of language. So really, I don't really think there is an easy way to separate these two. And also, if we think of, you know, like when we speak, we generate our language based on maybe trying to maximize our positive emotions, right? We want people to like us and so on. It's like the model itself has a very similar function, which is the utility function, right? The model essentially tries to please you the same way as people try to appear nice when they speak to someone else. So I think it's really complicated to separate these two.
And I guess we have a parallel in humans, like some humans are psychopaths, right? So they're not able to feel emotion in the same way, but they can tell you, oh, I really feel for you, I really care for you. But actually we know on the neurological level, they don't feel that emotion, right? So being able to name a certain emotion, sorry to contradict Marina a bit, like being able to name does not actually always create that emotion in our bodies. Okay, last question. So I wonder if we could talk a bit about the connections between human neurodiversity and AI language models. Humans don't all process reality in the same way. How then does AI process reality inputs, or how does it choose what output to put out? Right, so whether there can be any parallels between like neurodivergence maybe or AI, or some compare, you know, children and language models that like the methods of acquisition can be compared. So maybe Karin, if you could inform us from technical perspective here also.
I think there is actually very relevant thing happening this week in the AI world, because the new visual image generation model was released, like Stable Diffusion 2, which is slightly more, you know, sophisticated than the previous models. And people actually started complaining that it just doesn't behave the same. So essentially each of these trained models, when we train them, it's dependent on the data set, it's dependent on like different stochastic processes running in the background during the training, and each instance is gonna be different. So when we have a certain pre-trained model, we essentially talk of an individual rather than an algorithm in general. So every time we rerun this creation process, the training, we're gonna have slightly different entity which emerges out of it. So I think this leaves a lot of space for this.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting question. I guess we can point out that from the technical perspective, there's now a tendency to minimize kind of human intervention in how the AI picks patterns from the data. And every model picks it a bit differently, also based on the data set. So we see some divergence in the effects, right? Okay, I can see Michelle put her video on, which means I should be definitely wrapping it up. So yeah, over to you, Michelle, if you want to wrap up the event.
Yeah, I just want to say to everyone here what a fascinating 2 hours this has been, and really thank you all for generously sharing for these past few hours, but also in the previous weeks and months leading up to tonight's discussion. I also want to acknowledge the Center for AI and Culture at NYU Shanghai for partnering with us on this event. And also to acknowledge and thank our interpreters, as always, Emily Sun and Athena Zhang, for helping us communicate across languages tonight. And also our amazing team, Iris, Young, Jacqueline, and Zoe. Thank you all so much for participating and joining us for really just such an exciting and interesting and fun talk. I laughed and smiled a lot. For anyone that's interested in previous programs, actually there were talks by both Yin-Ju and Marina last spring that are up on the ICA Documents Archive. And then if you want to revisit this discussion, we'll have a recording published with subtitles in the coming months. So thank you all again for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you and goodbye.